I stagger because of Boulder Gym. That's where we played basketball, and because of the Pack River in northern Idaho, where I go fishing and where I fall, and I'm delighted to be here, and I'm honored for this distinction. Ever since I first arrived at WSU in 1973, the mission of WSU as a land-grant university has held a special place for me and for my family. The twin goals of educating mass publics to be both healthy political actors and economic citizens is what it does better than anybody else in any other institution. Also, I must say that WSU and Pullman have a special place in my family's history. Even some 25 years after we left Pullman, it's been that long. Ardith, my wife, and she earned her PhD here. My sons went to Pullman High School. They went to summer cage camp with Kelvin. Forrest studied music composition with Charles Argersinger, the late Charles Argersinger, who I'm sure was instrumental in his wonderful career. Lamar, our younger son, and Forrest is at the University of Kansas in their school. He just finished being chair of the program there in music. Lamar got his PhD at Berkeley and is we call it business and public policy, but it's really applied economics. And he's now at Washington University in St. Louis and editor-in-chief of the journal Organization Science and a distinguished faculty member with endowed professorship. And I can't remember what he did, but he worked in Mike Griswold's lab for a summer. And all of that is a testament to the kind of comprehensive influence that this place has on people who are willing to take advantage of it. And I must say also that every time the Cougars are on TV, football or basketball, they watch it, and we watch it, and root for the Cougars. I also root for the Jayhawks, but that's they don't play each other very often. Today I'm going to give an overview of my scholarly work, and I'll start with some personal observations about what about my life led me to do this and to keep doing it. But there are several caveats that are important. I'm going to focus primarily on the books, not the articles, because there are a lot more of the articles than the books. I'm usually involved in most things as a co-author. I've had Nicholas among others, more than any of the others. I'll refer to a couple published papers, but not many of them. I'm going to not do a deep dive into democracy, but you'll see that a lot of the research has some relationship to it, especially to the central role of publics to democracy. I'm only going to mention a few findings of each work, otherwise we'd have to get sleeping bags. The research often has a cross-national taint to it. We're relying on data acquired in multiple countries and also multiple states. Apart from routine data analysis, I shy away from such technological software intrusions as PowerPoint. And And then I've had all these wonderful collaborations with friends and faculty and students across the years. And so I'm grateful for that. As you now know, I was raised in Yelm, Washington, a pioneer logging town on a glacial moraine prairie just a dozen miles to the east of Olympia. But I'm not the only Yelmite here. Across the prairie to the east from our place, I had an amazing view of Mount Rainier. I mean, there was nothing in between except for a few trees. And if I got up on top of the house, a wonderful sight line to the Olympic Mountains. So, you know, it was hard not to have that kind of environment absorbed into your very being. And it was while I was in that community that I first became interested in politics and in natural resources and civic democracy. Now, my parents grew up on the Kansas-Nebraska border in the 1910s and 20s, not far from where Dick Claw was raised. And one of my grandfathers was a blacksmith, and the other an economically marginal farmer on the Republican River. Down right below Franklin, you know, Riverton is there. It wasn't until we moved to the Midwest that I found out that Republican didn't refer to the party. It referred to the governing structure of one of the local Native American tribes. It was a Republican form of government that they had, and so I guess I was disappointed about that. Both of my parents were trained at Kearney Normal Teaching College, 2-year school in Kearney. According to our family lore, at the age of 15, they taught in one-room schoolhouses and on the Platte River Prairie. Then in the 1930s, they left teaching and moved into a very small, drafty, and dirt-licking frame farmhouse in the Sandhills of Nebraska, near Elm Creek. And with my mother home alone by herself, my older sister was born there in that farmhouse. My father was in town trying to find a doctor. Later, as was the common case then, they were buffered by the Dust Bowl and the Depression. My mother actually kept a journal during that period, and she writes about how terrible things were. And all of that, the Dust Bowl, the Depression, the rest of it, led one of my ancestors to write that, quote, "The Pierces take to the Democrats like ducks do to water." And we were Roosevelt Democrats. My father and mother left Nebraska and emigrated to Western Washington State in the 1930s. My father left first, and then my mother came later to find work in the Northwest. My mother taught in a one-room schoolhouse before she came out in the panhandle town of Lisco, Nebraska. We've been there. We stopped there a couple times on our way back here when we drive. There are 80 people there. There's the schoolhouse in which she taught is still standing. It was made out of stone. And we met and talked to some of the people there. In fact, there was a woman out in the yard tending her garden who said that her husband probably was in my mother's class. But then in a few years, they both were in Washington State, and they carried with them to Washington a strong commitment to civic engagement in their community. In my mind, the core element of a democratic political life. They're not far from Yelm and the little logging village of McKenna. They worked on a dairy farm owned by a recent Swiss immigrant. While pregnant with me and gaining only 6 pounds, my mother cooked for the 30 men of the farm. And my father drove a milk truck 50 miles round trip into Tacoma each day. When I was 3, our small log dwelling burned to the ground. We then moved into an abandoned bunkhouse. We have one photo of that with a rotting front porch. We left the farm and moved into a glacial moraine fieldstone rental house in Yelm. It's not far from the schools, actually. My mother then obtained an emergency certificate for teaching during World War II. She taught for nearly 30 years after that, all the while attending night school at PLU in Tacoma, taking correspondence courses and going to summer school, ending up with more than 5 years of college credits. My father remained a truck driver, but he became deeply involved in the local civic organizations and community activities. Then my father died at 43, and my widowed mother stayed in the house at Yelm while she continued to teach. She died in the same house some 40 years later. As a teacher, and when she retired, she would drive out to the Nisqually Reservation to check on her students, since there was no phone service there at that time. In return, at her funeral in Yelm, at her age of 84, a dozen Nisqually women filed into the church, sat quietly in the back row, and then left when it was over. As another anecdote, many years later, while I was executive director of the Oregon Historical Society, I attended a fundraiser for the Columbia River Intertribal Fisheries Commission. I ended up sitting at a table with Billy Frank Jr. If you recognize that name, he was a Nisqually tribal member who was instrumental in reestablishing native fishing rights. The Bolt decision is the name of it. And he grew up on the Nisqually Reservation and said he knew Mrs. Pierce and that she was an honored person among the Nisqually. Our house was just outside of Yelm. Yelm is a name derived from the Salish language, which means shimmering grass, because it used to be a prairie and before there were houses there. Sometimes I'd walk a quarter mile to Yelm's one stoplight downtown and would stop into some of the shops, the dry goods store, the grocery store, the hardware store, as well as the weekly newspaper office of the Nisqually Valley News and 2 barbershops. I grew to be comfortable in those, what since have been called third places, a concept developed by American sociologist Ray Oldenburg, and meaning a space for informal, free social interaction essential to democracy. In those third places, as a teenager, I talked long periods with the men about local politics, but mostly with the editor of the newspaper, who was a Republican. In our home, prior to his early death, my father would have me sit with him and watch Omnibus every Sunday. Some of you may be old enough to recall that Omnibus was an educational television program that began in 1952. Alistair Cook, Leonard Bernstein, Joseph Welch, Helen Hayes, all were regular members of that. And on the bookshelf in my bedroom were books by William Shire, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, and Bertrand Russell, and some eugenics books inherited from my great uncle, which I discarded years ago. And then some early literary books on fly fishing. And during the summer weekdays and presidential election years, while the neighbors were gone to work, I would sneak into the Grindy house up the hill on our Clark Road, and one of the very few homes that had a TV. And for hours, I watched the presidential nominating conventions for both of the parties, rooting for a particular candidate, sort of like the March Madness. Mrs. Grindy was the town librarian and was said to have sung opera in New York. So we had all these kinds of cultural things floating around. That, along with the state capitol being only about 15 miles away, the Fort Lewis Military Reservation with its booming firing range 10 miles away, all day we'd hear the guns going. And the Nisqually Reservation very near us made me very sensitive to small town political life and social diversity. My father was involved in local civic clubs, the Masons, the Lions Club, and what I told was the Elm Improvement Association, which I later learned was a poker group. Had the school superintendent and the grade school principal. My high school was very small. It was Class B when there were only 2 classes in the state. We won the state championship when I was a freshman. We had students in 4 grades. It was rural, and at one time had the longest mileage distance in the state from one side of the district to the other. It reached all the way from Olympia to Mount Rainier, and a lot of my friends had, a half hour, 45-minute, an hour bus rides to get home at night. But it gave me the opportunity to do everything, including participate in student government, drama, music, and every sport we had, which there were only 3. Football, baseball, and basketball. And I often rode the school bus home with some of my student colleagues and would spend the night up in the mountains. And I also spent hours fishing alone for trout on the local rivers. Then, as you heard, when I left high school, I went away to college, all the way to UPS in Tacoma, some 30 miles distant. There I became a political science major, thinking I would go on to law school and perhaps to return to Yelm to run for public office. My advisor told me that I needed to take an accounting class to go to law school, so I signed up for it. After 2 weeks of accounting class, I dropped it. It was the only class from which I withdrew in my entire college and graduate career. I also dropped the idea of law school and running for office. But UPS was where Ardith and I met and became engaged. And we married a year after she graduated, some 58 years ago. So in a sense, my childhood was a fertile garden for my interest in politics and democracy. But I think it has been 60 years, to be honest, at my age, I really can't remember the precise number, since I was first introduced to the systematic study of politics. In fall 1964, senior year of my undergraduate work, I enrolled in a seminar in political behavior. The faculty member was just out of graduate school at Wisconsin and had been exposed to a rather new way of thinking about the study of politics. The book we read in the class was called The Behavioral Persuasion in Politics, published in '63, written by Heinz Uhlau at Stanford. I think you took a class from him, didn't you? Yep. Yeah. Was that in '63 or '43 or? That book reshaped the study of politics for generations, moving it away from a focus on formal institutions to that of individual behavior. And Uhlau stated that, quote, the goal is the explanation of why people behave politically as they do, and why, as a result, political processes and systems function as they do. Uhlau also wrote that what's important are the people's acts, goals, drives, feelings, beliefs, commitments, and values. But for many years, political science departments were ripped apart by conflicts between the behavioralists, of which I was one, and the institutionalists. But Uhlau said that one study of politics should concentrate on the behavior of individuals whose that's not mine, is it? Yeah. Whose interactions and transitions make up collective behavior. That made sense to me then, and it guided much of my scholarly research for the rest of my academic career. I was drawn to this burgeoning behavioral field in that senior seminar of my undergraduate work when I read a 1958 paper published by Herbert McClosky. His paper, Conservatism and Personality, assessed the linkage between personality and ideology, focusing on, is this yours? Yeah. Okay. Focusing on the personality psychological bases of conservatism. That topic fascinated me, and as I remember, I did an honors thesis paper on the question, but with a twist. I had gained voluntary access to the state prison in Walla Walla. I emphasize voluntary. Ardith's father worked there, and we were together, hanging out together at that time, and was a hunting companion of the warden, and I was allowed to do a paper and pencil survey of medium security inmates, trying to replicate that personality-ideology relationship that McClosky found. I must say this was long before human subjects issues. I couldn't do that now, I know that. I used a political and economic conservatism measure developed for the authoritarian personality, by Adorno et al. And that was a massive breakthrough in this area. And he also, we used an inventory developed by Raymond B. Cattell, who was one of the early pioneers in factor analysis. Not surprisingly, I found that the inmates there were negative about government and were authoritarian in their personality. Cattell also was a mentor of a psychologist with whom I worked as an undergraduate when I had a scholarship for a summer work-study appointment in a juvenile institution in Washington. There I did a paper in which I looked at personality changes during institutionalization at the facility using the high school personality inventory. With Cattell and the psychologists there, and using those data I had collected and analyzed, in 1966 we published my first academic paper in the Journal of Social Psychology. In retrospect, though, in fact, I had actually I thought about thinking of going into psychology, but it wasn't the counseling part. It was the data part. In retrospect, it did account for my interest in the causes and correlates of the individual's political thinking. Across my career, I linked much of my research agenda to various views of participation of citizens in democratic politics. These links obtained at three levels. First, there's the populist level. That is the concern with the mass publics, left or right, because you see a lot of talk about populism now with the Trump supporters. Pluralists or polyarchists, which focused on the role of competing interest groups, and elitists, focusing on individuals at the top of various social and economic structures, but with the contention that they governed in the best interest of the public. In graduate school at the University of Minnesota, my PhD dissertation replicated a portion of the classic book, The American Voters. That book looked at what was called the levels of conceptualization. It was an assessment of how people thought about politics based on two elements. One was the criteria that they used, and the other was the sophistication of the evaluations. And they rated the comments by the criteria, and the most sophisticated level was said to be ideological, wherein voters claimed to like or not like a candidate or party for ideological reasons, or as a neuro-ideologue, where they had a whole bunch of issue positions, but you could tell they're hung together by some common concept. And they went on down. Second level was group benefits, so they evaluated because of their effects on groups of voters, nature of the times, and then no issue content. For the dissertation, I took the same rubric and spent literally hundreds of hours in front of a microfilm machine and read several thousand voter evaluations recorded in 1964 to see if there was a change across time. And I found that in '64, the number of ideologues and neuro-ideologues said to be the most sophisticated, highest level, more than doubled during that period from '56. Ideological thinking increased in size from 11% to 26% of the public. Now, in terms of the quality of the Democratic electorate, at least two interpretations of that increase emerged. First, some scholars said that the small percentage of ideological evaluations, especially in '56, showed that voters failed to employ sophisticated criteria. And that any increase was simply kind of a contentless parroting of a campaign rhetoric. Others, including me, argued that many in the public may have the capacity for more sophisticated thinking, but unless the choices available reveal those, they're unlikely to appear. And that view was shared by V.O. Key, who was one of the greatest political scientists ever. So I felt good about that. And then another thing another related thing that was done by the people who did the American Voter was something that they called non-attitudes. They did panel surveys of voters over 6 years or three elections, looked at stability in the opinions. And if they changed, they said that those opinions were non-attitudes. And a colleague and I published a major paper in the American Political Science Review where we said that opinions and attitude structures are such that attitudes are banned and opinions at a survey time are a point. And so you could have some movement along the band and still, that's not a musical band. So we said that you could say I strongly agree with X issue position, and then the next time say I agree but not strongly agree, and that would count as a non-attitude. And there could be all kinds of short-term forces at play that would cause that movement between the attitude that's in your cognition and its revelation in your articulation to the surveyor. Then in 1980, I published a book with John Sullivan of the University of Minnesota. It was called The Electorate Reconsidered, and it was published by Sage. That book contained a group of papers that challenged the dominant, unflattering view of the American public's capacity for participating in a democratic political system. For example, political tolerance. Well, citizens strongly supported various notions of tolerance. For example, do you believe in the freedom of speech? Americans' actual political tolerance, an indicator of democratic attributes, was seen to be much lower when applied to specific groups that the voters didn't like. So they would begin the survey and say, what are your feelings about the Ku Klux Klan? What are your feelings about the Black Power? That kind of thing. And then if they like them or don't, then they go back and then they say, should you extend freedom of speech to these various groups? And they would find that speech was more likely to be supported for votes for groups they agreed with. And then in that followed by a book length on a public opinion. We titled that The Dynamics of American Public Opinion. It was published by Scott Forsman, and I did it with Paul Hagner and Kathleen Beatty. Paul was a colleague and Kathleen was a graduate student. And that focused on patterns in variations in individual and aggregate opinions across time. Then in 1976, with Harvey Dirksen of the Washington Water Research Center, I co-edited a book on water politics and public involvement in Washington State. And one of the things we did, we looked at concurrence between the attitudes of local water advisory committees and then the publics from which they were drawn, and to see if the advisory committees represented the public, that there's something called concurrence was the concept. And we found that democratic representation, that is concurrence, the distribution of preferences being the same among the people on the committee and those in the public, was greater when the members of the committee were selected by public officials and less when they volunteered, because when the public officials were concerned about representing the people that they might have to argue with later on. And so then about that time, I developed another long-term collaborative research agenda with an energetic and intelligent young faculty member we hired at WSU. His name was Nicholas Leverich. What year did you come? 77, yeah. Initially, we focused on natural resource policy questions, primarily looking at water resource policy and the role of individual knowledge levels in this quasi-scientific area, as well as in different political cultures. Over the years, we co-authored something like a half dozen books in this area, along with some others, and including ones where we contrasted American and Japanese publics, American and Canadian public differences, and then Russia and U.S. differences, all in a different, unique, shared policy context, but coming out of different kinds of cultures. Then in 1986, Loveridge and I also published the book titled Water Resources, Democracy, and the Technical Information Quandary. And what that was about was in response to post-industrial change in the country, there was the belief that the conditions had changed, and that so there's more security, there's greater demand for public involvement, and the quandary was if you were having more involvement in policy questions, and you had many more technical and scientific questions that were emerging also, how did you get the public to make informed decisions about those questions? And if not, then what would be the implications for democratic policy making? Then in 1989, with Takamatsu Abe, a visiting Japanese scholar, and Takatsugu Tsurutani, who was an American scholar and one of our colleagues in political science, we published a book titled Public Knowledge and Environmental Politics in Japan and the United States. And we focused on a single location in each country for a couple of reasons. The Spokane area of Washington State and the Shizuoka Prefecture of Japan each had a history of environmental issues with highly technical content. In Spokane, it was a rafting prairie, and the contamination of the aquifer by effluent from septic system, because the whole prairie was septic bound. In Shizuoka, Mishima, and the surrounding communities, the issue was the presence of Minamata disease as byproducts of local manufacturing that resulted in the mercury and PCB laced sludge found in Suruga Bay. So again, we focused on the knowledge that the public had, and then what their attitudes were about what policy ought to be done. In 92, we published another book called Citizens, Political Communication and Interest Groups, Environmental Organizations in Canada and the United States. Prager did that. And then we wanted to see, and this relates more to the polyarchy, the pluralist kind of question, what were the role of interest groups in helping deal with the technical information quandary and helping the citizens deal with that. And we did Canada and the United States because at one level they shared a common background, but on another level they had a different political culture, mostly having to do with groups. And the policy content was acid rain pollution, and so there was. So we interviewed people in Michigan and Ontario, and we found by the end of it that the differences around the role of groups was really interesting. That in Canada they liked interest groups better, but we found that in the U.S., environmental groups were more aggressive in pursuing the shared interest of the members in the group. So then in the late 1990s, with several scholars at the University of California, Irvine, Loveridge and I also participated in comparative studies of the attitudes of American and Russian publics in the context of the environmental side effects of nuclear weapons production at MIAC and at Hanford. It resulted in the book Critical Masses that MIT Press did. And ironically, in St. Louis, there's another place not too far from where we live where it has residue from that still, and it's still on the front pages of the Post-Dispatch almost every day, trying to get people to come in, trying to get the government to fund cleanup of this. And a friend I have developed there had written a book about that before. It's Coldwater Creek, and then In 2000, we did a book with Brent Steele, Mary Ann Steger, John Tennant, and it compared Canada and the U.S., focusing on the Pacific Northwest, Seattle, Spokane, Vancouver, and Prince George, in 3 policy areas: immigration, forest policy, and native claims, which were on the stage in both places. And we found that the similarities were greater than the differences, but and in all 4 places, there was a significant correlation between attitudes on native claims and those on immigration. And you can understand that from a perverse point of view, both dealing with the other. While such a relationship for forestry and native claims exists only in Prince George. And that's because the native peoples up there by Prince George had control over a lot of the forest lands. Then in 2017, with Leverage's Sage Council, although he didn't want to do any writing, Brent Steele at Oregon State University and I published a Springer Verloc book titled Prospects for Alternative Development in the U.S. West, Tilting at Windmills. And this was, we looked at people's attitudes and case studies about the proposals to put wind farms and other things up, and why it worked and why it didn't work. And we found that process matters. People supported it more if it was more open. And environmental values mattered. And the focus of the impact matters. We ended up distinguishing not just pro and anti-environmental with regard to these alternative energy technologies, but sort of the focal point of it. And so we ended up with globalists, the people who supported the like wind farms because of their concern about global warming, and then localists who opposed them, even though they claimed to be environmentalists, but they didn't like the damage to local plants and so on. Then in 2021, and I'm getting near the end, we diverted from pure environmental issues, and we did a book on sanctuary ordinances. That's immigrant, the contemporary politics of immigrant assimilation in America. And it had 2 major thrusts. We did survey data on with a national sample and a select set of city-based samples. And then we also did aggregate data analysis, where we looked at what kinds of counties had anti or pro immigrant policies. And we found that some kinds of political cultures were related to the rejection of anti-immigration sentiments. It's a culture called moralistic. It's one where there's communitarian kinds of interests. And then we found in some places that some counties had both pro and anti-immigrant policies, because I think the mobilization of pro in response to mobilization of anti. Then in 2021, also led by Nicholas, a group of scholars, of which I was one, published a book, Outside Looking In. What WSU Press did this one, which contained multiple studies of civility in American state legislatures. And we surveyed the perceptions of 1,200 state-level lobbyists. That's the outside part. So we could get people who were attached to the legislatures, but not part of them. And so we thought we could get a more distance and view. And we got 1,200 of them to respond. That was the outside looking in. One of the most interesting findings is that perceptions of legislative incivility are highest in states with greater income inequality. So the less equality there is in a state, the less civil the state is, because of the contention that's produced by that. Likewise, more electoral competition, term limits, conservative political ideology are among the most significant predictors of incivility. And it turns out that greater civility leads to greater legislative productivity. So if people talk to each other and were nice to each other and all that, then they were more likely to get things done. Surprise. Then, as an aside, for the last 25 years, I've enjoyed a parallel track of writing nearly 60 personal essays, of which I've published 4 collections, and I have a draft of what likely will be my last. It's called Searching for Home, One Stream at a Time. Most of those essays have something to do with observations around my life, including my family and the natural environment. But they're not too far distance from my other work, because some of the stuff, like I wrote one essay and it was published in a journal called Northern Journeys up around Sandpoint, called The Logger Savant. And so it came out of an experience I had in the meadow down below our cabin, and Nick's cabin and Herb's cabin. We share infrastructure. And I was down there one day, and there was this sort of grizzled, bearded guy working on a log, and he was sawing it up. And it turned out he was working for Jim Brown, who was a rogue developer up there. So I stopped to talk to him, and he had some beer, and he gave me one. And so I started asking him what he was doing, and we started talking about politics. And it turned out that he wasn't dumb at all. He was. That's why I said the logger savant. He had very articulate, sophisticated views about politics, and I thought, well, that's interesting. You drive up and down this road, and you see all these people, and you wonder, what can they be thinking? And he was thinking. So they've also essays like that have also been in Northern Journeys, Open Spaces, Plain Songs Review. And these collections are River Earth, published by WSU in '99, Catch and Release, published by Sweetgrass in 2006. And that was mostly about Lamar, our younger son's experience with cancer. The third one is called Beginner's Creek, and that was published by Whitefish Press. And that title came from experience I had in a library in Kansas. Oh, I was a bulletin board in one of the academic buildings, and I saw this mimeograph thing, and I thought it said Beginner's Creek. And I thought, boy, that's great. I wonder what that's about. And it turned out it was beginning Greek. Well, I thought, okay. So then a couple days later, I was in the public library, and they had the new books rack over there, and I looked, and I was probably like from me to Herb, but I thought there was one there that said Beginner's Creek, but no, it said Beginning Greek. And then, but that was not about Greek. It was a novel about a man and a woman flying across the country, but the reference was to a poem by James Merrill, who was a great poet, and I think poet of the country for a while, and he had written a poem about that. But I thought, well, that's a good idea. I mean, somebody sent that idea to me, so I wrote that the collection was Beginner's Creek, and a lot of that had to do with my experiences as a young child in terms of fishing and that. And then the last one was one of my friends and I were going to lunch in downtown Lawrence. And she was a very interesting person. She was an organic farmer. She was a Presbyterian minister. She was a county commissioner. And so it was great to talk to, and progressive, but not extreme progressive. And so we were walking up, and there was a sign in the window of the restaurant that said, "Nice trout, $10.99." And so, I went inside, and I knew Matt, the guy who runs the restaurant. I said, "Matt, what's this nice trout thing?" And he said, "Oh, I write all these elaborate menu descriptions of what the food is, and I just got tired of it." And so, but I thought, well, that would be a good title for a collection. And the title essay sort of explored what are the various possible meanings of nice trout. Could be how they taste, how they look, how they behave, because bull trout are aggressive. Yeah, yeah. So anyway, that was the last one, and now searching for home, which is searching for a publisher, and these are not strictly academic, but sometimes my academic thinking shows up in them, because some concepts such as patternicity, community, or political culture. Patternicity is I hear voices up there in the mountains laying at night, and you can hear them in the creek. And there was a person, I was talking to a person about this, and she said, well, there's a concept called patternicity, that if you can't understand something, you have a natural urge to impose order on it. And so one time, I heard Johnny Cash singing across the creek, singing "I Walked the Line," and I said, "There's no line in Idaho." Then about 6 months ago, the University Press of Kansas published Tom Foley, The Man in the Building, and that was along with Kenton, who's over here, I worked for him in D.C. for half a year, and then for Frank Church in the other half a year. And that was while I was on the faculty at Tulane University. And even then people saw him as a future speaker, which was very unusual because there never had been anyone from the West as the speaker. He was highly intelligent, inclusive, transactional, and transformational, and a very good person. He tried, and often was successful, to make the house a better, more responsive institution. We moved to WSU in 1973, shortly after the 5th district boundary changed to include Whitman County. In 1966, Gingrich followers led his electoral defeat and the defeat of many Democrats, and we established the Thomas S. Foley Institute for Public Policy and Public Service. I still have stark memories of Foley sitting morosely in resignation in his speaker's office a day or two after that defeat, because I was invited to go back and see him along with President Smith. And their memory, he was not angry, he was just saddened that he was unable to continue his work. And but we talked to him about getting his papers and some other stuff. And later, then the other stark memory was being on the mall out here and seeing the moving vans driving up with all of his stuff, his papers, and to the library, and also a lot of speaker's furniture, which was used to initially set up the office. Then 20 years later, I developed a friend in Lawrence, Kansas, who was editor of a series on congressional leadership, and we became good friends, and we talked about it, Burdett Loomis, and he said, well, why don't you guys do something on Foley? He'd been a congressional fellow also. So I came back and I said, well, I don't want to do that whole thing myself. That's not the kind of writing and research I do. But I had this great idea, which was that Kenton Bird, he was a writer and an editor, and actually he got his PhD in our political science department, and I was on his committee. And he'd done his dissertation on Tom Foley. So voila, only it's 20 years earlier, or 30 years earlier. And so I talked to the press, KU Press, about whether that would work, and they said, sure, write the book, and we agreed, and it took 4 years of Zoom meetings, phone interviews, summer lunches in Sandpoint, short-term rentals in St. Louis and on Drew Creek. We also returned to Kenton's initial interviews from the 1990s and re-interviewed some of them, and read through his papers, ironically of which there were not many. And that was one of the interesting things when we went into his office after he was defeated, asked his staff about his copies of his papers and his speeches and things to get a sense of what he believed. And they said, he never wrote anything down. He could do them, and if you transcribed them, they'd be literate and beautiful. He was a brilliant guy, but there weren't many things that he preserved for that. So with what we could get and the subsequent literature on congressional leadership, and then with that time, and then with the current chaotic leadership in Congress, Foley's stature has grown even larger. People long for him. And if you want to learn more, tomorrow at noon, in the Foley Institute, Kenton and I will be doing a discussion about the book we did. It's called The Man in the Middle. That was... Is there pizza, Cornell? Okay. And then the Man in the Middle was he was a transition speaker between the Democrats, traditional Democrats, and the new Republicans. He was often in between the Democrats and the Republicans. There's some great stories about when he was speaker and he'd just become speaker, and there was a floor vote and it was a voice vote, and it was clear that there were more Republicans saying one thing than what the Democrats said. But ordinarily what would happen is that someone would ask for a roll call vote because there were more Democrats than Republicans in the House. And Foley said, I can't remember, it was the ayes have it. That was a Republican position. And that had never been done before. They always retreated to an actual vote for it. But it was clear that they had voiced the loudest. And the Republicans stood up and gave him a standing ovation because here was a new wave of bipartisanship. So, in closing, again, I'm greatly honored by this award. For many years, many reasons, my years at WSU were the best. Ardith and I both had great careers here. Our sons got terrific formal and informal educations, and more important, lifelong values that reinforced the foundations of Tom Foley's career. Now, as Tom Foley said at the dedication of the Foley Institute here at WSU, quote, "In a cynical age, I still believe that we must summon people to a vision of public service. For in the end, this ethic determines more than anything else whether we will have citizens and leaders of honor, judgment, wisdom, and heart. These are the qualities this institute will nurture and advance, helping this nation become what it had always been destined to be, the best hope of a free people to live in an open and just society." Thank you.